If you're watching us on Livestream, we're going to put the Zoom link in the comments so you can join us from there. You're welcome to watch there or join us using that live stream. And so this is, as I said, the second public workshop. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Temescal GSA members, including the City of Corona, the City of Norco, Home Gardens County Water District. And my name is Jack Hughes, and I will be the meeting facilitator, and I'm from Kearns and West. So before we get started, I'd like to let you know that Spanish interpretation is available on Zoom. So if you are watching on Facebook Live and would like to come over to the Zoom platform and join us here, you'll be able to access that Zoom interpretation. And again, that link to come on to Zoom will be posted in the comments there. And at this point, I'd like to invite my colleague, Christian Mendez. He's here to make sure that the Zoom meeting's running efficiently. And so if you do have any questions in technical questions, how to use Zoom, you're having audio, visual problems, you can send a chat to Christian. But Christian is also going to make an announcement in Spanish and help guide anyone who might need that Spanish interpretation on how to use it in the Zoom. So, Christian.
Bueno, bienvenidos al segundo taller público del Plan de Sostenibilidad de Agua Subterránea de Temescal. Si están viendo una transmisión en vivo en Facebook, la interpretación en español está disponible en la reunión de Zoom. Se proporciona un enlace a la reunión de Zoom en los comentarios. Para acceder a la interpretación en español, en la reunión de Zoom, haga clic en el icono de la parte inferior para seleccionar español. Pueden enviarme un mensaje en el chat si necesitan ayuda para acceder a esto o necesitan cualquier otro soporte técnico de Zoom. Gracias.
Thanks, Christian. And like I said, feel free to send a chat to Christian if you have any need of help using Zoom, and feel free to chat him in Spanish or English. So you'll see on this next slide that this public workshop is being recorded, and when that recording is ready, we'll post it on the project website, and you can see that project website here. Christian's also going to drop that website link into the chat so you can access it, and we'll be sharing that later in the workshop too. So don't feel the need to grab it right away. It will be there, and we'll share it again. And so before we get started, I'm going to talk a little bit about the purpose of this workshop. This is the second workshop for the Temescal GSP. And we had another one earlier, and you can access information on that workshop at that project website. There's the summary, written summary, and there's also the video, so you can feel free to look at that as well. But at this workshop, we are getting ready to define groundwater sustainability for the Temescal Basin. And that's in order to ensure there's groundwater for current and future generations. And so before we do that, it's important to understand more about the basin. And today you're going to learn some important information that helps provide that understanding. So this workshop purpose is to give updates on the Temescal Groundwater Sustainability Plan. And so there'll be presentations on the hydrogeologic conceptual model, groundwater conditions, and water budget. But it's also an opportunity to learn more about what you think and your interests and concerns for the uses of groundwater. So we'll be asking you about that. And we'll also interested to know if you know of any current or historical problems regarding the use of groundwater in the Temescal Basin. So we're scheduled to go to 6 p.m. tonight, and we can certainly use all that time if there are questions and enough questions to fill that time. Otherwise, we might end a little bit early, but we are here till 6 if need be, and we're happy to use that time to answer questions. So before we get started, I just want to give a quick orientation to Zoom I know that many of us have spent a lot of time on Zoom up to this point, and so you might be very familiar, but this next slide will show just a few of the things you'll need to navigate Zoom. And so there's a number of controls on your Zoom screen, and you'll have an opportunity later to ask questions and give comments. So if you would like to do that by chat, there is, of course, in the bottom the chat icon, which you can click and type questions to that during the Q&A periods. And also, you know, if you do want to ask your question verbally, you can, we'll ask you to raise your hand, and you can do that in two ways. It differs slightly depending on your Zoom. So there is one option where there's kind of a hand icon at the bottom where you can press that and it'll signal a raised hand, and we will give you the ability to unmute yourself and you can ask a question there. And for some people, that raise hand function can be found by first clicking on the participants icon, those two little people side by side right there. And then that will open up the panel on the right hand part of the screen where you can press the raise hand. And at that point, we'll signal that we're allowing you to unmute yourself and you can ask the question there. So those are the Zoom basics. And next, I'd like to introduce some of the team that is preparing the Temescal Groundwater Sustainability Plan and is at the virtual workshop. And so I guess as we go through that, we also want to hear who you are, who you are attending this workshop. And so I'd invite you to write your name, and if there's an organization that you're representing, could you put that as well? So name and organization, and we'll have you give your introductions in that chat. And in the meantime, we'll go to this next slide. And so we're going to, this slide shows the members of the Temescal Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the GSA later. But right now, I'd like to note that we have representatives from the GSA here today. And so the members of the GSA are the City of Norco, the City of Corona, and Home Gardens County Water District. And I know we may also have some elected officials here. I'd like to also welcome them as well. I know that I saw the City of Corona Vice Mayor West Speak here, so I'd like to welcome Vice Mayor Speak, and we may have others, and I welcome you as well. And so the other introductions we need to do is just to quickly note that there are members from the consultant team today present at the workshop, and they'll be presenting. So we have Chad Taylor and Maureen Riley from Todd Groundwater who will be presenting. And of course, I am Jack Hughes, facilitator from Kearns and West. Almost ready to get started here. I just want to cover a couple tips for a productive discussion as we go through the workshop. And so for you, we would just ask that there's one speaker at a time, and we'll help control that by allowing people access to unmute microphones or reading questions from the chat that we will address. And we ask you to keep your input concise. And that also goes for us in answering questions. We'll want to make sure that we keep our answers concise and our responses concise so we can get to all of them. And actively listen and offer solutions. And we really do appreciate you being here today. Your input does matter. We will be recording your input and writing up a workshop summary. And that summary will be posted on the project website for you to see. And the planning team is going to consider all the comments as they prepare the groundwater sustainability plan. So we'll get to our first presentation now, which is going to be a review of what a groundwater sustainability plan is and how it's being developed in the Temescal Basin. And for that, I will invite Chad Taylor.
Thanks, Jack. So as Jack mentioned, we did have one prior public workshop for this groundwater sustainability plan. And in that public workshop, we went through some of the key components of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, as we call it, and also some components that are common to groundwater science, and common to groundwater sustainability. We're not going to go through all of those again today, just going to touch on some of them, but as Jack mentioned, that previous workshop is available at the project website, the GSA website, both the video of the presentation materials, and a summary of that presentation. So first, what is SGMA, or the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act? Very briefly, this is a landmark legislation really changing how groundwater is managed in the state of California. It importantly recognizes that groundwater management is best accomplished locally and provides some tools for local groundwater managers, which in SGMA parlance are called groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs. Provides those GSAs with tools that they didn't have before for monitoring groundwater use and ultimately controlling groundwater use if necessary. There is the option in this law for the state to intervene in cases where local agencies are not taking the reins and doing groundwater management in accordance with the law. That's not the case here. The three agencies that make up the Groundwater Sustainability Agency have volunteered to take on this responsibility for managing groundwater in the Temescal Basin, which is a big deal and very helpful. The state also offers some funding assistance for those voluntary agencies who step up to do this management. And there have been grants allocated for preparation of GSPs, groundwater sustainability plans, including the one that we're doing for the Temescal Basin. So that is very helpful. So what is a groundwater sustainability plan, or a GSP? These are detailed roadmaps for how groundwater basins will either achieve or maintain sustainability in the long term. They're similar to other planning requirements within the state that agencies like the GSA here, the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, have been undertaking for many years. They have periodic review processes and annual reporting requirements that go along with the long-range planning. And they have a planning horizon that includes 50-year simulations of future conditions to make sure that the plan is able to maintain sustainability in the long term. It's not a one and done, it's a living document that will go on for the long term. This particular groundwater sustainability plan covers the Temescal Groundwater Basin. The blue outline you see in this map shows the area covered by the Temescal Basin. The boundaries of this basin were defined by the State Department of Water Resources, or DWR, and they're based roughly on geology, as we'll see a little bit later today. Importantly, this basin does border a few other groundwater basins, the Chino Subbasin to the north, the coastal plain of Orange County to the west, and the Riverside Arlington Basin through the Arlington Gap on the east, and the Bedford Coldwater Subbasin on the southeast. These bordering basins are also important in this process. The Temescal Basin, luckily, has been able to form one GSA to cover the whole area, because it has been historically considered and managed as a connected groundwater basin, a connected system. This single GSA allows us to prepare one groundwater sustainability plan for the whole basin, which is a real benefit. This basin has been prioritized as a medium priority basin by the Department of Water Resources. And that means that in Sigma, medium and high priority basins are required to complete groundwater sustainability plans. And so we are required to create one here for the Temescal Basin. So we've mentioned a little bit already who the GSA is, and this is additional review from our last meeting. But this organizational chart shows the relationships within the GSA and for GSP preparation. You'll see the city of Corona is leading the GSA and the GSP preparation effort with assistance from Norco and Home Gardens. The Department of Water and Power is providing most of that leadership within the city of Corona, although elected officials and other members of the bureaucracy of the city of Corona are also helping. The city has hired a consultant team that's working with Department of Water and Power staff. That includes ourselves at Todd Groundwater, Kearns and West, who's helping facilitate this meeting and doing a lot of the outreach, and Carollo engineers will be helping us when we get to some more of the traditional civil engineering aspects of the plan towards the end. The GSA has also identified a technical advisory committee that's made up of public agencies, local businesses, well owners, and other community interests to provide feedback, high-level feedback on the plan as we complete it. We are having technical advisory or committee or TAC meetings once a quarter. Those are also open to the public. And those are times we go into a little more detail on components of the plan to get that technical feedback. This broad base here of this organizational chart shows everybody who's on this call today, other local agencies, interested parties, and stakeholders who are curious or concerned about groundwater in the basin. We really want your feedback. That's why we're having these meetings. And that's why you're on the org chart. So we appreciate your time today. We did, as I mentioned, go into some other groundwater science aspects in the previous meeting. I'm not going to touch on those today. Please feel free to review those previous presentation materials if you're curious about that, or ask questions today.
Thanks, Chad. Next, we're going to have a presentation about the hydrogeologic conceptual model, which helps provide a description for the physical features within the Temescal Basin. But first, we're just going to do a little bit warm-up question that will help us to start thinking about those physical features. So Christian's going to launch a Zoom poll here that will ask the question, how many major aquifers are there in the Temescal Basin? So we'd like to have your best guess for that. I think that should be launching here in a second. And while we do that, if you do have any questions on what Chad has covered so far, please feel free to use the raise your hand functions or put them in the chat. So it looks like that poll's up and available, and I'm seeing a number of answers going in. We'll give it a couple more seconds just to see if anyone wants to weigh in. Okay, so we're going to end that poll, and we're going to share those results. So it looks like for the question, how many major aquifers are there in the Temescal Basin? The most popular answer was 2, followed by 3 and 5. And so now I'll bring Chad back and we'll see how we did. Chad, what would you make of those answers?
All great answers. There are multiple aquifer units in the basin. We typically tend to think of them as 2 They are connected, as I mentioned before. So one would also be an appropriate answer. We didn't put that on here to avoid confusion, but we tend to think of them as two, and we'll talk about that a little bit in our hydrogeologic conceptual model presentation coming up next. So I'm going to launch into that. Before I get started on this, I want to tell you, everybody on the call today, this topic and the other topics that directly relate to GSP chapters that we're going to discuss today are relatively technical. We're going to do our best to not overwhelm with technical details and just touch on some of the topics that are included in these components of the groundwater sustainability plan. I'm going to show you a series of maps, for instance, in this conceptual model discussion that are also in the chapters that have been prepared. Those chapters are available on the project website. So anyone who wants more information, please feel free to go and download those chapters and read the text of them and look at the maps and charts and other diagrams that are in there. That'll give you some additional technical detail that we're not going to provide today, just to make sure we're maintaining interest throughout the attendees. But if there's technical information that I'm not touching on and you'd like more information today, feel free to ask the question and I'll do my best to answer it in a meaningful way. Okay, so what is the hydrogeologic conceptual model? This is an important foundational component of the groundwater sustainability plan. It's a series of descriptions and maps and graphics that help us define where groundwater is in the basin, how it moves in the basin, and where recharge occurs, and what that system looks like. When we talk about groundwater, these are some topics that we went over briefly in the first meeting, but what we're really looking for is where could groundwater exist underground? And typically that looks like coarse grain material or sands and gravels like you might see at the beach or the side of a river. And those materials have spaces between them that can accommodate water, both storage to just be there and movement to move through those materials. We like to distinguish those from fine grain materials, which are like clays or silts. You can think of clay, if you play with Play-Doh or you did any ceramics, that's the same stuff, that's the same consistency. And you can imagine trying to pour water through clay or Play-Doh, it's just going to run right off. It does a similar thing underground, it just hangs on those finer grain materials. So when we're talking about a hydrogeologic conceptual model, often we're looking at where are things coarser versus finer? Where is it more like the beach or like the river gravels than it is like a bag of clay? We do this by looking at and describing a series of required components that relate to the basin. And those include the boundaries of the basin, the superficial and subsurface geology in the basin, where the aquifers and aquitards is a fancy word for those fine grain units, the material that doesn't allow water to flow through it, what the aquifer properties are, and how groundwater is used, otherwise known as beneficial uses of groundwater. Who benefits from using groundwater? And we want to capture all of those uses. Like I mentioned, we do this both through descriptions and graphics. We're going to look today at some of the graphics. We're going to look at geology maps and some cross sections. But we also have graphics showing topography, surface water, and basin thickness in the chapter that provides some more detail that you should go look at if you're interested. So jumping right in first to Surficial Geology. This is a simplified version of a Surficial Geology map. There are more units, more distinguished units within this basin and its surroundings than are shown here, but we've collapsed them into similar materials for the purpose of ease of understanding in this case. This map shows this light yellow color, which you can see comprises most of the interior portion of the basin and surrounding basins. That's the young, unconsolidated material, typically also called alluvium. These are largely coarser grain materials that that are young and so haven't been around long enough to become solid rock. They're more like soil than they are like rock. You also see some scattered light gray locations. These are older, partially consolidated materials. Consolidated just means in the process of or having become rock. And so these might be a little bit denser, a little less likely to contain water, but still not what we call bedrock, which are the older rocks that have a limited capacity usually to store and transmit groundwater, or at least more limited than the younger alluvial materials. The bedrock in this case, you can see, is this dark gray color that mostly makes up the exterior of the basin. And in fact, the Department of Water Resources, DWR, generally uses the bedrock to alluvium or younger unconsolidated material contact as their guidance for where to draw these basin boundary lines. Also important to note in this map are fault locations. We have a number of faults that run through the basin, and they do have an important groundwater function or groundwater relationship in this basin. Faults have a tendency to restrict groundwater flow laterally, and they do so to a limited extent here. They do that by moving material up and down adjacent to each other, and makes it harder for groundwater to move when there's a lower permeability, what we call lower permeability, finer grained material adjacent to what was coarser grained in another block of the fault. Now that gets a little complicated, but they do form an important part of this basin. Now, as Jack mentioned in our poll, we had a question about aquifers. The principal aquifer in the Temescal Basin is the channel aquifer. The approximate extents of the channel aquifer are shown here in this light blue color that runs from the Arlington Gap through central Corona and up into the Prado wetlands, the Prado management area. This channel aquifer is more like beach sand and river gravel than anything else really in the basin. It's more consistently coarse grained, and the wells in this area are more productive than other areas of the basin. And as a result, most of the productive municipal water supply wells now and historically, most of the historical high production wells have been in this channel aquifer. So it's an important component of the groundwater system. It is not the only component. These other areas of the basin, both north and south of the channel aquifer, do also contain groundwater in secondary aquifer units. They're usually slightly older materials with slightly less coarse grained portions. There is groundwater does move between these two units. They are connected, and the secondary aquifer units also exist below the channel aquifer. So it still is a single system, but in Sigma we're required to identify the principal aquifer, and in this case, that is this channel aquifer that we're seeing here. So one of the key tools that we use as hydrogeologists and geologists to understand what's going on underground are cross sections. You can think of these as slices through the earth where a geologist can use information gathered from drilling wells or other resources to make an interpretation of what's happening underground. What material is underground? What are the relationships between various material types? And in this case, how does that affect groundwater movement and groundwater presence? We've prepared 3 cross sections for this basin, and you can see them labeled here as A to A prime, B to B prime, and C to C prime, with A going through the middle portion of the basin, B extending along the Arlington Gap, and C going through the Norco portion and a bit of the Prado area. Today, we're going to look at cross-section A, which is A to A prime here, because it's pretty indicative of conditions throughout the basin. and is a good representation of the conceptualization of the basin that we've built in the chapters that you can read online. So here is that cross-section A to A prime. You can see that it goes from the southwest here at A to the northeast at A prime. It starts in the Santa Ana Mountains, where we have some of the more bedrock outcrops that are, not great for groundwater. Not to say that there is none, but they don't contain as much groundwater as the basin materials that we're looking at here in the basin. You can also see that as we move from the southwest towards the northeast, we get into these alluvial fan aquifers underlain by the sandstone aquifer. These are our secondary aquifers that I mentioned. Before we move into the channel aquifer, shown here in this yellow, adjacent to the Temescal Wash. The Temescal Wash deposits are quite similar to, often kind of the same and indistinguishable from the channel aquifer. And so we consider them functionally similar and connected. All of this is underlain by this granitic bedrock, which is not very good for groundwater presence or flow. And so that forms the bottom of the basin in most cases. As I mentioned, this channel aquifer, this is our principal aquifer. And you can see that many wells are completed only in the channel aquifer. And these are some of our higher producing wells used by the city of Corona for water supply. Some wells are perforated, you have screens below the channel aquifer, or both in and below the channel aquifer. The screens in these wells are denoted by this second line here, adjacent to the line indicating total depth. That's where the water comes into a well. And so you can see that many of these productive wells completed only in the channel aquifer. These are some of the most productive wells in the area. So together, these descriptions and graphics, some of which we have not looked at today, but are included in the chapter, as I mentioned, help to provide us a three-dimensional representation, so to speak, of the groundwater basin. You're going to see this block diagram again later today, but this is that same cross-section just flipped because we're now looking at it as if we were in the north looking towards the south. And it shows the relationship between the subsurface materials and the ground surface and the basin boundaries here in this case. You can see, the Santa Ana Mountains sloping into the city of Corona, the Temescal Wash flowing through the basin, and the neighboring groundwater basins to the south, the Bedford Coldwater Basin, the Arlington Gap, close to where this cross-section ends. And you'll see this again, as I mentioned. So now we're going to pause on the conceptual model, and then Jackson can come back in and see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Chad. That was a great presentation, and it's really fun to see a map of the area and imagine all of that right below our feet. It's kind of like a whole nother world. So we're going to pause here for questions and comments. If you have any questions on this section, we'd like to have them here. And as a reminder, you can raise your hand using the raise your hand function on Zoom, and we can call on you to ask, or you can put those questions in the chat. And if you're also watching on Facebook Live, you can feel free to write a comment there, and we have a staff member who will help make sure that we can read it over here. So we're ready to hear any questions or comments you might have. And I'm going to keep an eye here. I don't see any raised hands off the bat. And while we'll wait, just as a reminder that there is a draft chapter covering this material in more detail available on the project website, and that goes the same for the groundwater conditions chapter. So if you do want to read more detail, you can go to the project website. and read those. And we have a section where you can fill out a comment form. And so if you want to fill out a comment form and give us some feedback on those chapters, you can do it there as well at any time. Let's see, I see no hands raised yet. I don't see anything in the chat as of now. So I think we can move on to the next section. And if in the meantime, you do have a question about this previous section, we're happy to answer it at the end of this following section here. So please feel free, we can go back and check that out. So we're going to move on to the next section, which is about groundwater conditions. And those groundwater conditions give us an understanding of basin health over time and help show patterns of use that are important for defining current and future sustainability. So I'll bring Chad back up and we'll go to that section.
All right. So as Jack mentioned, the conceptual model does give us an idea of what's happening underground from a structural perspective. Groundwater conditions, this section of the GSP is intended to talk about current and historical conditions with regard to both groundwater elevations, water quality, interconnected surface water, which I'll define in a little bit, and subsidence and some other factors. As Jack mentioned, these are foundational, fundamental principles that we need to define for the basin and conditions that we need to define for the basin that help us as we move forward with defining sustainability. What does sustainability look like locally, and how are we going to maintain it over time? So while these still are some technical topics, they are important to this goal of sustainability in the basin. We're going to walk through some of the components of the groundwater conditions chapter. As with the hydrogeologic conceptual model, this chapter is available online, and I would encourage you to read it if you'd like some more details and or ask questions today. So we're going to start with groundwater elevations. We commonly talk about groundwater elevations, or sometimes you'll hear the term water levels or depth to water, and that probably bears a little bit of explanation briefly today. So groundwater elevation is just like topographic elevation. It's the height of water in any given location above a reference point. In this case, we usually use sea level as a reference point, just like we do for topography. And so this elevation contour map, you'll see has values on these contour lines. These are groundwater elevation contour values. And so each line represents an equal elevation in groundwater at those locations. When we talk about water levels, that can mean either groundwater elevation or depth to water. It's not a very precise term. It's a term used more to describe general conditions. We talk about depth to water, we're talking about how deep is water at any given location below the ground surface. And so typically when you measure groundwater levels, you're measuring a depth from the ground surface in a well or a piezometer or some other physical structure that accesses groundwater. This map, as I mentioned, shows groundwater elevation contours. Now, these are just like topographic contours that you might see on a topographic map. But instead of representing the topography at the ground surface, they represent the topography, so to speak, of groundwater as it exists underground. We use groundwater elevation contours primarily when we're showing water levels over in space, because they give us the opportunity to show equal groundwater conditions everywhere, which allows us to see what flow looks like underground, flow of groundwater. In this case, you can see we've got these large blue arrows that go perpendicular to across the lines of groundwater contours. Just like with topography, if you picture pouring water on a hillside, it's going to flow down the hill, and topographic contours, if you'll recall, go across the slope of a hillside. And so these function exactly the same. These arrows show how water would flow, does flow, downhill, so to speak, in groundwater in the basin. So this contour map represents spring 2017 conditions. So it's a snapshot in time, but it is representative of general groundwater flow patterns within the basin over time, especially the more recent historic groundwater flow patterns. We generally have flow coming from the south, southeast towards the northwest, and also from the northeast towards the west. And these converge here right in north central Corona, and then flow towards the Prado management area, where there is some daylighting of groundwater most times before the shared boundary with the coastal plain of Orange County groundwater basin here in this canyon. In addition to those groundwater elevation contour maps, which, as I mentioned, provide a snapshot in time, we also look at groundwater conditions over time. One of our best tools for doing this is what we call hydrographs. And that's just a fancy word for a graph of water, hydro, over time. And so this graph shows water levels as they have been recorded in Corona well 15, which is a well with a quite long record going back into the early 1950s, as you can see here. And we're showing all the measurements collected for depth, for groundwater elevation in this well for the whole period of record from early 1950s to late last year when we collected these data. You can see that there are seasonal patterns in the water levels here, but also larger scale patterns responding to changes in climate conditions, weather conditions, wet and dry cycles, and pumping. This hydrograph, while it is for only one well, is pretty representative of many of the wells in the basin, especially those in the principal aquifer. It shows that groundwater conditions were generally the highest in the 1980s. Many of us will remember that there were pretty heavy rains in the 1980s. And this also corresponded to a time when groundwater pumping in the basin was at a little bit of a low. And so groundwater elevations came up during that period. Subsequent dry cycles and increases in pumping caused groundwater elevations to go down. This hydrograph also shows pumping water levels in addition to static water levels, which are generally what we focus on. Static water levels means water levels, depth to water, or groundwater elevation that is not influenced by pumping. So it's a measurement taken when a pump in a well is turned off. And those are generally represented by this average line if you squint through these data. You can see that there's a lot more pumping occurring in the recent data set than pumping measurements than in the past. As I mentioned, the highest water levels occurred in the 80s, following heavy rains in the late 70s. Later in the 90s, there were some dry periods, some wet periods, where water levels did not recover quite so much as in the 1980s because of increased pumping. Many wells have had their lowest water levels, their lowest static water levels in the last 10 years or so, largely because of the drought of record that occurred between 2013 and 2016, represented here in this relatively low period. Those water levels have been recovering, but it is a little bit of a slow process given the relatively limited precipitation that we've been seeing, especially this year. The groundwater conditions chapter, as I mentioned, also documents water quality. In the Temescal Basin, the water quality that we've been most concerned about for the longest time has been total dissolved solids, or TDS, which is salt for the most part. It's a variety of salts, not just table salt, but other dissolved chemicals. Most of these come from rocks, from water being in the ground. It absorbs rocks, minerals, and salts from just contact with soil. Some total dissolved solids, TDS, also comes from activities at the ground surface, from human activity, and can be concentrated through use and return of water to a groundwater basin. We're also, and you can see that there are some high total dissolved concentrations, solids concentrations in this basin, especially here in the channel aquifer portion of the basin. However, the city of Corona, whose wells these mostly are, does treat and blend to make sure that the water they deliver meets all the applicable standards for distribution for public health. Nitrate has also typically been a constituent of concern, a chemical that we're concerned about. Nitrate mostly comes from activities performed by humans. It comes from agriculture, historic agriculture, and other irrigation practices where we're irrigating on top of fertilized crops or even grass. It also comes from wastewater treatment and disposal, especially septic systems and less regulated forms of wastewater treatment. You can see that there are some high nitrate concentrations represented by these yellow, orange, and red colors in the basin. But once again, this is something that the city of Corona, who's the primary pumper within this area, recognizes as a problem and treats and blends to manage prior to distribution. And that treatment and blending, both for TDS and nitrate, also serves a function to, over time, reduce concentrations in the basin over long periods. There are other constituents that the city of Corona and other agencies in the area are concerned about. And so we're tracking those, and they're discussed in the chapter. If you would like to read about those, you can look at them in that chapter. So I mentioned interconnected surface water. This is a new concept in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Interconnected surface water means that groundwater is shallow enough to be connected to a surface water body, whether a creek or a river or a lake even. It typically happens where you have shallow groundwater associated with creeks or rivers, and the groundwater can flow into the creek or vice versa. The creek water can flow into groundwater. And you can imagine that in areas where there's a connection between groundwater and surface water, high volumes of pumping could lower groundwater elevations and become problematic for interconnected surface water conditions. There are ecosystems that rely on interconnected surface water. In Sigma, these are called groundwater dependent ecosystems, or GDEs, as a shorthand. And this includes not only species of animals that might live in an aquatic environment, a river or a lake or a stream, and require flow of that stream to be relatively consistent or high enough to maintain their health. It also includes wetlands and riparian vegetation, phreatophytes they're called. Those are plant species that rely on shallow groundwater to meet their water demands. Their roots actually extend deep enough that they can access groundwater, but if groundwater isn't shallow enough, they can't just keep sending roots down And so they need that shallow groundwater to maintain their health. In the groundwater basin, in the Temescal Basin, the primary interconnected surface waters that we're concerned about are in the Prado management area. Here, the southern portion of the Prado management area that's outlined by this hatched polygon. Those are areas where there are there's historically been shallow groundwater. There are wetlands. There are phreatophyte plants that rely on groundwater for at least a part of their source of water supply. And we want to make sure that we are considering those as we move forward with groundwater management and sustainability. That is a defined beneficial use in this groundwater basin. So we want to make sure that continues to be protected. Many local people will be familiar with, that as a natural resource, as a photo of those wetlands. We don't want to do anything through groundwater management to damage those wetlands. And I should have mentioned subsidence is also covered. Subsidence is a relatively technical topic. It's deformation of the ground surface as a result of groundwater pumping or reduction in groundwater heights. That is discussed in the chapter. Please feel free to go and read that. We didn't include that today for brevity.
Thanks, Chad. It was a great rundown of a lot of what we know about the conditions of a really important local resource. So appreciate that. And we're going to pause here for questions and discussion. So I do welcome you. If you can write something in the chat, you can use the raise your hand function on Zoom to raise your hand, and we'll get you unmuted and you can ask that question or make that comment. And also, if you're on Facebook Live, we're watching there too. Feel free to ask questions there. So while we wait for people to type or ask a question, we also have a prompt here that we'd like to hear from you. And that is, do you know of any current or historical problems regarding the use of groundwater in the Temescal Basin? So it's important that we're thorough and documenting these, and so we really appreciate if you have anything that we should be aware of. So feel free to answer that question or ask one of your own or make a comment as you wish. And as I'm monitoring here for questions, raised hands, I do see that we had a question if we could share the address where people can read that draft chapter, and we provided that link in the chat. So you should be able to find both those draft chapters as well as the previous one for the plan area on the project website using that link. I'm looking for raised hands. I'm not seeing any yet. And Christian, can you help me make sure I don't miss any raised hands? Looking to see once more if any hands are going up. Anything in the chat? Nothing so far. And so I recognize that maybe answering the question might require more careful look at the chapters, but if there is anything on your mind in terms of issues regarding current or historical problems regarding the use of groundwater in the basin, please just let us know. And I'm going to give it a couple more seconds here. Part of the reason we're waiting a little bit longer is the Facebook Live is on about a 30-second delay. So what we're saying is getting to folks there a little bit later. So I just want to make sure that we give time for people to ask any questions. Okay. So I don't see any questions or comments as of yet. We will have a place, one more spot where we're going to do a Q&A after the water budget here, and we'll be asking one more question for input. We're going to launch another question using the Zoom polls for you to answer, and so we'll have another opportunity during this section, which will be on the water budget. And so I'm going to now invite Maureen Riley up to give the presentation on the water budget.
Hi, and as Chad was describing the groundwater basin, he looked at the geology, the hydroconceptual, the hydrogeologic conceptual model, groundwater conditions. But another way to look at understand the groundwater basin is to look at the inflows and outflows, the water coming in and out of the basin. The purpose of the water balance is to really quantify those inflows, so we know what's coming in over time into the basin. It varies year to year. You can have a wet year and a dry year, and it also varies month to month, as the hot summer months could use more water. It also changes by groundwater management. You could have a change in where the wells are pumping, where water is being recharged. And so it's important to look at it both over time and space. For inflows, some examples of inflows into the Temescal Basin include recharge from rainfall, stormwater, and stream flow, reclaimed water and percolation ponds, and subsurface flow from other neighboring basins. As I mentioned, we want to look at it over both time and space. And so we're going to revisit Chad's block diagram to give an approximate location of where some of those inflows occur. You can see the channel aquifer, where the Temescal Wash comes in. Temescal Wash recharges the aquifer during the unlined portion, which is further to the south. Another inflow is rainfall, which occurs across the entire basin. But we also see a lot of recharge from stream flows or canyon runoff that comes from the edges of the basin. And finally, we have the subsurface inflow from neighboring basins, whether it's the Bedford Coldwater to the south, Arlington from the east. There's a few neighboring basins, and reclaimed water is another inflow, and that's the percolation ponds that are located in the channel aquifer. Just like we look at inflows, we also want to look at outflows, water leaving the groundwater basin. And the biggest outflow is groundwater pumping that's used for beneficial use of municipal water supply. In addition to pumping, there's flow to the Santa Ana River, and also a small amount of evapotranspiration that occurs. We're going to head back to the block diagram and show those approximate areas. Where pumping is coming out of the channel aquifer, as Chad described. The Santa Ana River is where the Temescal Wash meets the Santa Ana River. And the evapotranspiration would occur again during the unlined portions of the Temescal Wash area. Some people like to think of the water balance as a checkbook, where you're keeping track of what your income and your outcome, your spending, to look at the balance of your bank account. Similar like that for water, we're looking at the inflows and we're taking out those outflows and looking at the change in storage. How much water do we have in storage in the groundwater system? We're looking at this both over time and space, as I mentioned, and we're using a numerical model, which is a complex mathematical simulation that uses those inflows and the outflows to calculate our change in storage. But it also uses the elements of the geology and hydrogeologic conceptual model that Chad went over to simulate the groundwater aquifer. This is a great tool because not only can we simulate what has happened, we can also predict future conditions. One of the requirements of Sigma is that we have to fast forward 50 years into the future and see if the groundwater basin remains sustainable. You can see the arrows on the block diagram, the inflows and outflows. So looking at the groundwater storage into the future, we can test different projects and plans and see how the basin responds through this numerical model.
Great, thank you so much. It's fun to see that block diagram kind of spring to life and things move through it. So we are at a place where we are pausing again for questions and comments. So this will be our kind of last section here for questions and comments, and before we launch one more poll and ask for a little bit of your input there, and then we will go through and wrap up and talk a little bit more about the future opportunities for your participation, and then we'll close the meeting. But if you do have a question or a comment, please raise your hand again using the raise your hand function on Zoom. I'll keep an eye out for that. We're watching the chat, and we're also waiting to see if we have any comments coming in from Facebook Live.
Jack, I just added a question from Wes.
Great, yeah, I see that. So we have a question here, and it says, can you talk about how we use the Santa Ana River for groundwater recharge?
This is a bit of a complicated topic. The Santa Ana River has some requirements for discharge of treated wastewater. I think that's probably what Vice Mayor Speak is referring to. While not, there's some interplay there between what is recharge and what is stream flow. But the city of Corona and other local agencies who collect and treat wastewater have requirements for a minimum amount of water that they need to discharge to the Santa Ana River. Some of that does recharge groundwater. Some of that continues to be surface flow that goes into the Prado area, the Prado management area, and benefits those wetlands. Some of it becomes groundwater and then later benefits those wetlands by being shallow groundwater in those areas. So in the location where those discharges occur, it's a bit of a complicated mishmash of groundwater and surface water, as one would expect in an area of interconnected surface water. I hope that maybe starts to address that question, Vice Mayor Speak.
Yeah, and if there were any follow-up questions on that for further explanations, we welcome it. It's always an interesting thing to explore those connections between surface and groundwater. I'm seeing no raised hands as of yet, and nothing more in the chat. And it looks as if we don't have anything from Facebook Live either. So we will, I'm going to check one more time just to see if I see anything else here. Okay, so we have another question in the chat asking, can you discuss sustainability? So I think this is looking forward to where we will start to define sustainability in the groundwater sustainability plan, which we're really going to get into coming up in the next public workshop. But I'll let Chad, can you tell us a little bit more about what sustainability means in this context?
Absolutely. So unfortunately, we don't have any graphics prepared to help explain this for this meeting. As Jack mentioned, we will have subsequent meetings where we discuss what sustainability means in the context of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. and locally in the Temescal Basin. Briefly, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act provides for groundwater sustainability agencies to define sustainability locally within a certain framework. So, and that framework begins with a sustainability goal, which is a statement of what is important locally for groundwater sustainability, what specific factors are most important for local stakeholders with regard to sustainability, and then moves into definition of undesirable results, minimum thresholds, and measurable objectives for 6 specific sustainability indicators, they're called. So undesirable results are significant and unreasonable conditions with regard to any one of those sustainability indicators, which I'll mention here in a sec what they are. Minimum thresholds are numeric thresholds for evaluating where undesirable results begin and end for any of those indicators. And measurable objectives are quantifiable goals for where you would like to be with regard to any one of those 6 metrics. The 6 metrics which you don't know about yet, which I will now mention. So the 6 sustainability indicators are water levels, which is groundwater elevations or depth to water, as I mentioned earlier. Groundwater storage, which is, as Maureen mentioned, the volume of water or the change in the volume of water that in a groundwater basin. Degraded water quality, which are those constituents of primary concern and others that we talked about briefly in our groundwater conditions discussion. Seawater intrusion, which is actually not applicable here because we're an inland basin that's not facing a saltwater body, so we don't have to worry about seawater intrusion. Subsidence, which I mentioned is discussed in the draft chapter, but is the deformation of the ground surface as a result of decreased groundwater elevations, water levels. And then the 6th one is interconnected surface water, beneficial uses associated with interconnected surface water. So it's largely looking at those groundwater dependent ecosystems that we mentioned, riparian vegetation, aquatic habitat for aquatic species, and in some cases, minimum flows for things like recreational uses on recreational water bodies, larger lakes that are connected to groundwater or rivers that rely on groundwater flow in or out to maintain their recreational potential. Those are the 6 sustainability indicators. Once again, we need to assess what is undesirable, significant, unreasonable impacts associated with each one of those, and define the line where that where undesirable begins and ends. And that is what sustainability means. The GSA is in the process of defining the sustainability criteria in collaboration with the Technical Advisory Committee. And we're working on a sustainable management criteria chapter of the GSP right now.
Thanks, Chad. Very, very thorough explanation. And as Chad mentioned, this next public workshop that will be coming up in the summer will be getting into more about the sustainability management criteria and other topics. So I don't see any other hands up. I don't see anything in the chat or from Facebook Live. So we will start to close up. We have a few more slides before we get to talking a little bit more about the next opportunities for you to get involved. We're going to ask one more question. So as we're considering sustainability through the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, we have to consider all beneficial uses and users. And so we really do want to hear from you today about what you think the most important uses of groundwater from the Temescal Basin are. So you can choose up to 3, and the options are groundwater dependent ecosystems, industrial water supply, municipal water supply, rural residential water supply, small commercial water supply, and small community water supply. And so these are all important uses, and we do have to consider them all, but we're just interested in hearing from you what you consider the most important, what matters to you. So we're getting some of those answers in now. We'll give a couple seconds more for people to make their selections. All important uses, so it's always hard to decide. Okay. So I think we can end that polling and display the results, see what we get. All right. So it looks like we got a lot of people selecting municipal water supply. Also, rural residential was very important. Groundwater dependent ecosystems and industrial. And then there are some votes here for small community water supply. So that kind of gives you an interest, and it's good to see that we have a lot of representation of those different interests and people selecting those as interesting uses. And so thank you for doing that, and we will make sure to consider that as we move forward. So move to wrap up here. Before we do, I'd like to go over these last few slides here about how you can stay involved. And so we're going to move forward here to this next slide, which kind of shows you the general project schedule. We need to be done by January 2022. And so you can see there'll be a little animation graphic here that we already did our public workshop 1, which was a kick and introduction to Sigma. And today we are here at public workshop 2. And later in the summer is when we will have public workshop 3, which will be focused on those sustainability criteria that Chad talked about, as well as management actions. So we look forward to seeing you at that workshop coming up this summer. And then the draft GSP presentation will be another opportunity for you to get involved. And that will be a presentation that will take place at GSA member board or city council meetings. And we'll keep you updated about when those dates will be and how you can get involved there. And so we also want to give you a couple other opportunities. Make sure you're aware of other meetings that you can attend as members of the public. They are open to all. So we do have a technical advisory committee that helps to bring in a broad interest as well to bear on the plan and bring that input in so that we're considering all those users and uses. And these are open to the public, and we do have a public comment period. So if you want to attend and make comment at those, you're welcome to. And if you can't attend the meeting, we also post the summaries on our website so you can read what is discussed there. And our next one will be later this spring. There'll also be, similar to the draft GSP presentation, there'll be an adoption hearing for the GSP. Another opportunity where you'll be able to get information and make comment. And so we've made mention of this a number of times. We have the website, and we can drop that link in the chat one more time just so you can get that. We really do invite you to go to that website, and that's where you can review the draft chapters. There's a comment form. You can submit comments on the chapters, ask questions, or generally get in touch with those using that form. And you can also learn about future public workshops as they are upcoming. There's also other kind of resources in there explaining Sigma and the GSP and things about the Temescal Basin like fact sheets. So you can find those there as well. And so we'll display that information one more time. There is the email and there is the website. And one more thing we're going to do before we move to close up is drop a link to a survey in the chat, and that is to give feedback about this workshop so we can help improving these workshops for you and make the next one better than this one. And so if you have a little time to fill out that survey as we drop it in the chat, we'd appreciate that very much. And we thank you very much for attending today and spending some time with us. And we hope you have a good night and take care of yourself and your community. Thanks so much.